What's up, y'all? Phyrexia OB1 is coming out, and it is another really interesting set that is really bound to shake up standard and several other formats. I am really excited about this set. I think there's a lot of really interesting cards, but really nothing that seems broken to me. Maybe the number one card that I'll be talking about here in a little bit, but in general, nothing really seems broken. Just a lot of really interesting cards and some new um, keywords that we haven't seen in a while, like toxic, which used to be infect, kind of works the same, but not. We'll talk more about that in a little bit as we cover some of these cards, because as I have done before, I am going to cover what I believe are going to be the top 10 cards for standard. So these are cards that I picked that I believe are going to be really impactful. And as I talk about these cards, they're going to be cards that are going to be good in the current meta. As the meta will shift, again, we don't know exactly how some of these new effects are going to play into that. I don't know how good Toxic truly will be. I don't know how good the Proliferate decks will truly be. But looking at some of the existing decks that have shifted throughout several sets coming through, obviously they're good regardless of the set coming in. I've kind of looked at some of those decks and see how they might shape up with some of these cards that are going to come in with Phyrexia will be one. So that's how I picked my top 10. And as always, I have a bit of a disclaimer. As I selected these cards, there's one type of card that I've excluded. So if you've seen my videos before, you know that I typically don't want to include lands because, especially if you're an arena player like myself, you want to know what to spend wild cards on. In reality, there's 5 new lands coming through that are going to be great for any kind of multicolor decks. So if you have wild cards you need to spend them on these first before you go into some of the flashy cards that I might be talking about here in a little bit. Another thing I wanted to say before I really jump into my top 10 list, like I said, none of these cards are truly broken. I don't think my top 10, as I was selecting cards, there were probably 10 other cards that easily could have made it into this top 10 list because they were so close in power level, in my opinion. Mainly because there are so many answers now. Like Standard has gotten several sets now, and I really believe that overall there's answers to all the problems that are going to come with this set as well. So keep that in mind as I'm going through these cards. Like, these creatures are going to be easy to remove. There's answers, like even the ones that have certain effects to them where you don't really want to block them in combat, maybe. There's exile effects, there's sacrifice effects, you can remove artifacts pretty easily, enchantments pretty easily. There's all kinds of removal in the format now. So as I talk about these top 10, keep in mind that I'm looking at it as 10 most impactful cards for standard, not necessarily 10 super broken cards. There's a difference there. Before I jump into the top 10 itself, I had to throw in one honorable mention. So before I go into the actual top 10, this is my like. It wasn't even number 11, but it's a card I'm super excited about, and it's going to be a game finisher if it hits the board and stays on the board. And it's Tyranics Rex. Tyranics Rex is 4 green, 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 so 4 and 3 greens for a creature Phyrexian dinosaur. That's an 8/8. This spell can't be countered. It has Trample, Ward 4, Haste, and Toxic 4. So the biggest thing that's different between Toxic and Infect is that Toxic adds poison counters equal to the number on the card if it deals damage. So even if Tyranics Rex only comes through it with 1 point of damage, it'll put 4 toxic counters on an opponent. Where before with Infect, if it deals only 1 damage, it's only 1 Infect. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Why I'm so excited about this card, this is like Carnage Tyrant reinvented, and I loved Carnage Tyrant when it was in Standard. I was a Golgari mid-range player, and it was my jam. Tyranics Rex really gives me those vibes. It's a little bit more mana, but 7 really isn't that much. If you look at it, like the Titan Forge sees a lot of play, and I think that this can see a lot of play too. It's not as versatile, and that's why it didn't make the top 10 for me. Because typically, if you play spells this big, you want them to be versatile. You want them to be a little bit controlling, and Tyranics Rex doesn't have that. Tyranics Rex is a finisher. It is aggressive, and 7 mana and aggressive typically don't really go together. But overall, when it hits the board, if you find the right deck for it, and I will do whatever I can to do so, it's going to finish the game pretty quickly because it's very hard to deal with. It's going to do damage with the 8/8 trample, and it's going to add 4 poison counters to an opponent. So it's very hard to deal with once it hits the board, and it's going to finish game. So I'm just really excited about it. It's a really cool card. So now it's time for the actual top 10. So I Apologize, we're 5 minutes in, and now we're starting with number 10, but I always like to give a little bit of disclaimers up front. So let's go to number 10. What do I think are the top 10 most impactful cards for Standard? On number 10, I have Looka, Bound to Ruin. It's 2 red/green Phyrexian mana, and a green. So what that means with the Phyrexian mana, if you aren't familiar with it yet, like we had Tamayo that had it, and then Ajani in the last set, but just a refresher, the Phyrexian mana means that it can be paid with either a red, green, or 2 life. If life would pay to this Planeswalker enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters. So technically you can play it on turn 4 if you don't have any other ramp. So 4 and 2 life, and then it comes in with 3 loyalty instead of 5. +1 ability, add red and green floating mana. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells or activate abilities of creatures. -1, create a 3/3 green Phyrexian Beast creature token with Toxic 1. -4, Looka deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers, where X is the greatest power among creatures you controlled as you activated this ability. I think this card is being overlooked. I have not heard as much hype about this card as I feel for it. Why I think it's so good is because it's well-rounded in decks that run some creatures, and Gruul colors run a lot of creatures. I think this will find a home in Junt decks, Junt mid-range. They have a couple larger creatures. They might even just run Shouldered, which is still a 4/5. Once this hits the board, if it comes in with 5 loyalty, it can immediately deal. Let's say you just have a Shouldered on the board and you play this on turn 5. You deal 4 damage divided how you need to. That's already a pretty sweet controlling ability. Maybe you don't play Shouldered with it. Maybe you just have like a Shakedown Heavy on the board, and you deal 7 damage by turn 5, divided how you need to. So overall, it's very flexible in that -4 ability. But the other 2 abilities are also really interesting in any kind of creature deck. Being able to put another 3/3 body on the board for only -1 loyalty, that's not bad at all, especially with the amount of proliferate effects that we might see being played. Toxic 1, really good. I don't know how good Toxic is going to be in Standard, but it's a nice little addition to put a clock on an opponent. And then the +1 ability is where I'm also really excited. Adding 2 floating mana is a lot. That it's just limited to creature and creature abilities is not that big of a deal because you're going to be running plenty of them if you play a Looka Bound to Ruin. Those are the colors you'll be doing that in. So overall, I think this is a very versatile card. It's not expensive for 4 or 5 mana. So I could easily see this being like a 1 or 2 of in a lot of decks. Just because of that flexibility. You have the ramp, you have to put in bodies on the board, and you have a little bit of controlling factor. It's really everything you want in a Planeswalker, in my opinion. So let's go to number 9. Blue Sun's Twilight. X blue for sorcery. Gain control of target creature with mana value X or less. If X is 5 or more, create a token that's a copy of that creature. We've seen steal spells before. They have a mixture of being good or not. Right now you've got like Invoke the Winds, which is very expensive to cast, so that's why it doesn't really see a lot of play. It sees some play in mono blue, but other than that, it's not seeing play. Why I think this is so powerful and why I think you're going to see this a lot more is because of the versatility again. It's going to be able to be played in a lot more decks because it only requires 2 blue. The added effect of X is 5 or more create a token, that's great as like really being able to make a big hit on your opponent. Let's say they've got a big creature on the board and you can cast 7 mana, stealing it and making a copy of it, you can finish the game potentially the next turn. But why I like this so much is not necessarily the creating a token. That's great, but for 7 mana, there's a lot of spells that are much better. Where I like this is that maybe even your opponent, let's say they just played Looka and they created the 3/3 Beast. For 2 mana, you steal it. So that's where the flexibility is really good because the mana X can be 0 and you can steal any token on the board that's a creature. But again, it just has a lot of flexibility depending on the mana you want to sink into it, depending on what your opponent has. If they have a strong creature on the board, maybe you already have more mana on the board and you can spend that 7 mana on it to really blow them out. It has a lot of options, and that's why I think this is going to be really good. This is going to be a very frustrating card to play against. So let's go to number 8. Bloated Contaminator, 2 and a green for a creature Phyrexian Beast that's a 4/4. It has Trample, Toxic 1. Whenever Bloated Contaminator deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. For those that don't remember what Proliferate does, choose any number of permanents and/or players and give each another counter of each kind already there. So the biggest one that we're looking at for this set is toxic counters, or toxic for poison counters. So let's say you have a poison counter on an opponent, you can, once you proliferate, add an additional poison counter on top of that. But why I also like it is in this color, in green, there's quite a few planeswalkers now in green or green adjacent colors um, that you can proliferate loyalty counters. In green, there's a lot of +1/+1 counters on creatures that you can proliferate. Proliferate is going to be very powerful, especially in the green color. So that's why I think that is a really nice little extra effect here. Being a 4/4 trampler for 3 is already really good. Adding the toxic and adding the proliferate effect to it, it basically makes it a toxic 2, and it just overall adds so much value. So I think you're going to see this in a lot of decks. Green aggro is going to be a thing, I feel like, but even in other decks that run any kind of counter anywhere is going to want to run this just for the added value. So overall, I think this is a very powerful card. So let's go to number 7. White Sun's Twilight. X, white, white for sorcery. You gain X life, create X 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. If X is 5 or more, destroy all other creatures. I was really interested in this card the first time I read it, and the more I think about it, the better it got. It is a very versatile spell. Again, it can be good in like white or Celestia, maybe Abzan toxic decks. Like if I look at kind of like the new decks that can be created, technically, like from a limited standpoint, they're really pushing Abzan toxic. But I think in a constructed format, we're going to see a lot more mono white or Celestia toxic, maybe. Um, but what I like about this is that it's really good in more mid-rangey decks as well. I don't think this is necessarily an aggressive card. If you need to gain some life, you can, and then you create some bodies. The downside is they don't block, but they can put some pressure on the opponent. So you gain some life and you put more pressure on your opponent. That's a really nice little combination. In white, there's going to be a lot of added effects that kind of make your might stronger. If you have a lot of tokens, you can gain a lot. Their lifelink. There's other effects that this will synergize with. But even if those don't see play, this is a possible finisher in control decks. Biggest downside is these tokens will not have haste. So that's kind of a thing to keep in mind. That's why this is number 7, not higher in the ratings. But it is a one-sided board wipe that leaves creatures on the board to pressure your opponent, which is great. We have good board wipes in the format. We have Farewell in the format, which I think we'll see a lot more play with this set. But if you are wanting something to gain a little bit of life back while you wipe the board and put some pressure on your opponent from that moment on, I think this is going to be a very solid card for it. That's why I think this card will see quite a bit of play, and it's going to be quite painful to get hit with this card, and especially if it's the 7 mana or more, where you lose all your creatures and suddenly you have this Phyrexian Might army opposing you with Toxic 1 that can finish the game in maybe 1 or 2 turns. So that's why I put this at number 7. Going to number 6. Phyrexian Obliterator. Black, 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 black. So 4 blacks. For a creature, Phyrexian Horror, that's a 5/5 with trample. Whenever a source deals damage to Phyrexian Obliterator, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents. This is a reprint, and whenever it just came out in Arena, in the historic format at the time, now it's more Explorer. I don't really keep up with those formats on Arena as much, but I remember when it just came out there that people were really playing with this and messing people up because it is very easy to completely destroy your opponent's board just by playing this card. Again, there is a lot of removal in the format now. It's not an artifact, so Go for the Throat, Infernal Grasp, Fateful Memory. There's so many cards that get rid of this. Like I said before, there's a lot of removal. We can't necessarily keep that in consideration when we determine how good these cards are. Because if you don't have that removal, you can't block this because you're just going to really destroy your board. It has trample, so you can't chomp block it. Every time you chomp block it, you lose a permanent. So you're going to have to commit to really blocking this and losing a lot of your permanents. So that makes this really difficult to deal with. If you do not have removal on hand, dealing with this card is near impossible, and it really destroys your board. So you have to choose, like, okay, do I just lose 5 life at a time until I have that removal, or do I have enough permanents where I can sacrifice those to get rid of this card? Very, very interesting decisions, and that makes this card so powerful. So I'm really not looking forward to opposing this, and I'll be playing a lot of removal in my decks because of cards like this. Going to number 5. Phyrexian Arena. So 1 black and a black for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. Another reprint, but also just very good. It's not as fast as possibly Gigs for 1 black and a black that can have multiple creatures attack, draw multiple cards, and lose a life per. But it's a nice little effect on the side that starts accumulating value really quickly. Losing a life for a card is a great effect. What's also nice is, like, some of the better cards in black on turn 4, like Sheoldred, Gix Puppeteer, which I don't think sees nearly enough play for how good it is. Those cards will really turn that around to where you drawing cards and losing 1 life. You're going to turn that around into gaining more life than you're losing and potentially making your opponent lose life. Same as Quasar, Augur of Agonies, which is not nearly as good, doesn't see as much play, but again, it's one of those cards that can benefit from this card. Phyrexian Arena is great for value, and I think that the loss of life is not relevant at all. It's basically just a free card every turn. Being an enchantment, it's a little harder to deal with because there's a little less enchantment removal in the game, and as you play more enchantments, to invoke despair is not nearly as big of a deal to deal with as well. So that's why I put this at number 5. I think there's going to be a lot of value from this, and there's going to be a lot of decks that are going to want to play Phyrexian Arena. Number 4. Phyrexian Vindicator. So this is the Obliterator's rival for white, 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 white. So 4 whites for a creature Phyrexian Horror that's a 5/5 with flying. If damage will be dealt to Phyrexian Vindicator, prevent that damage. When damage is prevented this way, Phyrexian Vindicator deals that much damage to any other target. That is actually really powerful. It's a 5/5 flyer at 4 mana, so that's really nice. But especially that not being able to, like, it has to be a straight removal spell. You can't just deal damage to it. You can't, like, red spells are useless against it. Except for there's 1 red card, I forgot what it's called, but it's a 3-mana red card that deals 3 damage and no damage can be prevented, or something along those lines. But still, like, it's very hard to deal with this card unless you have straight removal. Why I put it so higher than Phyrexian Obliterator is mainly because it's a flyer at 5/5, so it puts a lot of pressure on. Trample does as well, but I think flying is better. And I can just see this fitting in mono white decks. I think mono white's going to want to run this card, and I think mono white is going to kind of step away a little bit more from soldiers. Soldiers will still be a top deck, I have no doubt about it. But just looking at this color as a whole and the cards coming out with Phyrexia will be 1. I think there's going to be another mono white deck that's a little bit more well-rounded in what it's trying to do, and I think Phyrexian Vindicator is going to be in that mana 4 slot as a potential finisher that's very hard to deal with for the opponent. So that's why I put this at number 4. I think this is a very powerful card. It's going to be very hard to deal with, and it has some really cool controlling effects. So yeah, that's why I think this is going to be a very interesting card. So we're down to the last 3. So far, if you've liked what I've said or anything that you want to discuss, feel free to do it in the comments. And I would love to hear your thoughts and kind of maybe spitball a little bit. So let's go to number 3. Got another Planeswalker on number 3. Vraska Betrayal Sting. For 4 black and 1 black Phyrexian mana, you get a legendary Planeswalker Vraska with 6 loyalty. So again, the Phyrexian mana can be paid with either a black or 2 life. If you do 2 life, it enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters, so it comes in with 4. For 0, you draw a card and you lose 1 life, proliferate. So again, like the Phyrexian mana, drawing a card for 1 loss of life is a great trade-off. That it proliferates means that you do get a loyalty counter on your Vraska, and you can put a loyalty counter on your other Planeswalkers. You can put more counters on your creatures, which you might do in these colors, and you can add more poison counters to your opponent. So overall, I think the proliferate effect is actually really powerful. Even if it didn't have proliferate, it was just you draw a card and you lose 1 life, it would still be a good ability. Proliferate is just extra icing on the cake. -2. Target creature becomes a treasure artifact with tap, sacrifices artifact, add 1 mana of any color, and loses all other card types and abilities. Whoa, that is so cool. It is such a cool effect. You can take any creature and turn them into a treasure artifact, and that's it. That's it. It's not until end of turn. It's not anything like that. So it is a -2 removal on any creature. But what's cool about it is the versatility. Again, I love versatility. I've used that word a lot um, this top 10 video. Um, you can use it on your own creatures to ramp if you need to. Let's say you have a creature and it's like, hey, this creature's not going to do anything for me. I'd rather have mana. Turn it into an artifact. Turn it into a treasure. Artifact synergies, if you have them. I don't know exactly what you'll run this in, but I feel like this card is very versatile and it's going to fit in a lot of decks. If you have artifact synergies, being able to turn a creature you own into an artifact when you need it, for like affinity or any other effect, that is a really great extra added ability. So all in all, I really think that -2 ability being straight removal or ramp is just really solid. -9, so if you get to the ultimate, if target player has fewer than 9 poison counters, they get a number of poison counters equal to the difference. So basically, the -9 is you set your opponent at 9 poison counters. Any poison counter you add after that, or you proliferate after that, whatever you might do to add 1 more poison counter after that, you win the game. So in true Vraska fashion, the ultimate is a game finisher, as it has always been with Vraskas. I love Vraska cards. I'm a huge fan. Really sad she's completed, but the card is fantastic. Number 2. And on number 2, I'm going to have a card that I feel like some of y'all are going to think should be number 1. Honestly, I could even say that it maybe is a little lower in the rankings, but let's just talk about it. Alice Norn, Mother of Machines, for 4 and a white. It's a legendary creature, Phyrexian Praetor. It's a 4/7 with Vigilance. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponent controls to trigger. So I really was torn on rating this card. I had really hard time rating this card. I ended up putting it number 2, and I feel good about it, and I will tell you why. And then I will tell you why I was torn about it. So why I think it is really, well, actually, no, I'll tell you why I was torn first. Because of Yarok the Desecrated. Yarok the Desecrated was a 3 in Assault Eye, 2 in Assault Eye. I don't remember. Yeah, 5 mana total. So 2 Assault Eye mana for basically the same effect of entering the battlefield, costs a triggered ability, it triggers 2 times, and a Death Touch lifelink, and it was a 3/5. It was good, but it didn't see a lot of play because it was a little too slow. I'm afraid Alice Norton is a little slow as well. It enters the battlefield, and initially it does nothing. Or so I thought. I'll explain more. Initially, it's just a 5 mana 4/7 with Vigilance, and after that, you probably, if you cast this on curve, you're not getting any value out of it right away. So all in all, it's not super exciting. But why I ended up putting it at number 2 is mainly the second or the last paragraph on this card. Permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponent control to trigger. That is incredibly good. So let's just think of some of the cards that are enter the battlefield that are very strong. Being able to shut down, so let's say you go up against Mono White or Azorius Soldiers, and they play Resolute Reinforcements, only getting 1 creature instead of both because the enter the battlefield effect is not triggered. Or again, same matchup, Brutal Cathar. Brutal Cathar comes on the board and it's just a 2/2. It is not going to exile a creature unless the night and day cycle happens. Portal to Phyrexia. Permanent entering the battlefield does not trigger the ability of the permanent. So Portal Phyrexia enters the board, it's not going to sacrifice 3 of your creatures. Blade Coil Serpent, those triggers happen once it enters the battlefield, so those triggers are negated by Alice Norn. Some other things that, like Bloodtide Harvester, coming on the board and not generating a block token. That is very powerful and very hard for the opponent to deal with. So unless they have removal for this, a lot of cards that see a lot of play are not nearly as good. They just become plain bodies on the board. That makes Alice Norton really powerful. Now, that other ability is kind of nice for generating value for yourself, don't get me wrong. And permanent entering the battlefield causing a triggered ability. Let's say you play Bloodtide Harvester, instantly coming on with 2 Bloodtide tokens, being able to tap next turn and take down a 4 toughness creature. Briarbridge Tracker is a really cool creature that comes in with 2 clues because of this. Lauren of the Third Path being able to destroy 2 enchantment or artifacts and or. Airtide Resurrection, being able to come in and take out 2 cards off the stack or destroy 2 creatures or a combination thereof. Or even a Titan of Industry. Again, just very powerful effects with this card. Where I think this is going to be interesting, I see this in Naya colors. I see this being built in Naya colors. With Storm to Festival, you play this on turn 5, and then like turn 6, you throw Storm to Festival on the stack, and you get a bunch of value. That's where I really see this being very good. There's also a card that I'm going to talk about here in a minute that benefits tremendously of Alish Norn. So, all in all, I do think that this is one of the best cards in the set, mainly because it negates your opponent's stuff, but also you do generate value if it stays on the board. So, that's why I put this at number 2. I am going to build with this card a lot. Like I said, I think I'm going to build with the Naya colors. If you're interested in seeing like my thought process on how I'm going to build some of these decks, or what some decks I'm thinking about without truly building the full 60 cards, I am thinking of doing a video like that where I kind of cover 2 or 3 deck ideas I have and what kind of are going to be the key cards in that deck. So if you would love to see that, let me know and I'll work on that. So with all that being said, it is time to get to number 1. If Alish Norn is not number 1, which is a very powerful card, then what is? It's actually a card that can benefit from having Alish Norn in your deck as well. It is also in the Naya colors, so again, this is going to be a card that I will be including in that build. It is All Will Be One. Phyrexia, All Will Be One. 3 red enchantment. Whenever you put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, All Will Be One deals that much damage to target opponent, creature an opponent controls, or planeswalker an opponent controls. I think it's only fair that the set name for Phyrexia All Will Be One is going to be the name of a card that's this powerful. At first glance, you're like, okay, counters, that's great. Like I put a toxin counter on somebody, I'll do a damage. I put a counter on a creature, I do some damage. Maybe if I plus one of my planeswalkers, I do a damage. Think bigger. Think if this is on the board and I put a planeswalker on the battlefield, the way that works from a rule standpoint is I put a planeswalker on the battlefield, let's say it has loyalty 5. Those 5 loyalties don't come on until the planeswalker's on the battlefield. So the planeswalker gets on the battlefield and then the loyalty counters resolve on it. I don't know if that's the right phrasing, but that's how it works. So as you play a planeswalker with loyalty 5, this will trigger for 5. So you can do 5 damage to a creature, a player, or a planeswalker an opponent controls. If you have Alish Norn on the board, if that's an enter the battlefield trigger, so a planeswalker entering the battlefield and having those loyalty, it'll trigger twice. If you have any kind of enter the battlefield trigger that generates counters, it'll be twice. So with Alish Norn, this is even more powerful. But even without Alish Norn, just having planeswalkers on the board, this card is going to be nuts. If you have any kind of proliferate, this card's going to do a ton of damage because you're going to put a bunch of counters on your stuff every time you proliferate. If you already have counters, of course. So all in all, this thing is going to really get out of hand quick. It can be burn damage, but it can also just be a control factor, and that's where I think this will shine. I think this will shine in a more controlling fashion where you take out opponents' creatures, you take out opponents' planeswalkers, and you can really pressure them with your things or keep building your board because you don't have to worry about your opponent's pressure as much because you're taking out all their creatures. So that's why I think All Will Be One is going to be so good. I think you're going to see this in Planeswalker builds, mainly because of loyalty being the best way to get a ton of counters moving quickly. But all in all, this card is just going to be tremendous in a lot of different builds. This is again going to be a card I'm going to put in a Naya Storm to Festival deck that's going to have Planeswalkers, it's going to have Proliferate, and it's going to have some toxic counters going around. All in all, it's going to be very powerful. Yes, it can be removed with a Terra Sunder, Lorn of the Third Path, maybe even Invoke Despair if you don't have any other enchantments to sacrifice to it. But it's not as easy to remove, especially if you have multiple enchantments and Invoke Despair becomes less good. This card is going to take off and it's going to take over the game pretty quickly if you don't have an answer to it. And that's why I put this at number 1. So, All Will Be One, Phyrexia, that's my list for the top 10. So let me know what you think. Like I said, if you would like to see some deck ideas I have and what cards I would put in it to build it and kind of create the core of some decks ideas that I have, let me know. I would love to work on something like that and post it for y'all. Anyway, thanks for watching. Leave me a comment, subscribe if you like these videos. I don't post them a lot, but when I do, I would love for you guys to see them. Thanks so much for watching.